So in this talk, I kind of just want to talk about my own journey as an artist and I guess some of the things that I've learned along the way. And I want to talk about like how I learned to draw, basically. Um, I've kind of come to this point now in my art practice where I'm pretty comfortable drawing a lot of subjects. I can't draw everything. I'm not sure if it's possible for one person to draw everything, but I can draw a lot of things. I can draw portraits. I can draw human figures. Uh, I can draw creature designs. I can draw architecture, and I can draw perspective. Um, so I've kind of come to this point in my practice where I'm very comfortable drawing multiple different subjects, and I'm not trying to say that to brag or anything like that. Like I'm not. I don't mean it like that at all. But the reason I'm telling you this is because that was not always the case. Like I am pretty comfortable drawing a lot of subjects now, but 5 years ago, that was not the case at all. Um, there was a point where I was extremely unhappy with my artwork because I wasn't drawing the things that I truly wanted to draw. Um, 5 years ago, maybe closer to 6 years ago, I think I must have been about 24 years old, roughly. Um, but a lot of my artwork consisted of drawings that I copied from photographs. And I was kind of going down this sort of hyper-realistic route where I was doing extremely detailed drawings. Um, and that was pretty cool, I guess. But it wasn't fulfilling to me because I wasn't truly drawing the subjects that I actually wanted to draw. It's like the only thing I could do was copy from a photo. And I know some people are impressed by that. I had a lot of my friends and my family members tell me how impressed they were when I drew this drew this drawing and I copied it from a photo, and they just were in love with how realistic it looked, blah blah blah. But um, I just didn't like my own artwork because it wasn't original. It wasn't me, It wasn't my idea. I looked at a photo and I just copied it, and that was it. And that's all I could do. And I was really sad about that. Like I was really, really upset because when I was a kid, I used to be so imaginative, And I don't think my drawings when I was a kid were that good. Like, yeah, I would look at them now, and sometimes I laugh at how bad some of them were. But the imagination was there, Um, I grew up with Warhammer. That was like one of my hobbies when I was a kid, and I would look at some of the illustrations in those Warhammer books, like the codexes, and I was just blown away by those illustrations when I was younger, and I still am actually to this day. They're just so impressive, and the fact that they were done traditionally too is just, man, it's just a testament to human creativity. I think a lot of them. I think a lot of people look at it and they don't see it as like fine art or whatever. Like it's a bit too. It's got too much of a graphic novel style to it or whatever. But I I kind of disagree. I absolutely love those illustrations, and they played a very very big part of my childhood. And because a lot of these drawings they were done with like acrylics and inks and pencils, and it was just amazing that there were artists out there that could draw to that level of ability. And I remember when I was a kid, I was like, man, I hope I can draw something like that one day. You know, I was like, I really hope I get to that level of skill. And so, fast forward to when I was, yeah, about 25 years old, I was extremely unhappy and unfulfilled with my artwork because I just kind of it felt like I was just regressing, honestly. I didn't feel like it was getting better. All I could do was copy from photos, and that was it. I just didn't have a single creative bone in my body. I could not imagine any kind of complex fantasy scenes or anything like that. It just wasn't in me. So I was very close to giving up on drawing back then. And yeah, it was demotivating. It was really demotivating. I didn't want to pick up the pencil at all. So that was not a fun time. So then I thought, well, maybe if I go to one of these art academies that teach, they teach you to draw and paint from life. I thought maybe that would help. And that wasn't possible for me either, because I just could never afford to go to one of those academies. I could never afford to study at these universities that train illustrators and concept artists. I just never had the money for it, unfortunately. I wish I did, because it would have helped me a lot, but that the reality was it was just never going to happen. So, at this point, I just felt like I had two choices, right? I thought, well, I can either just give up because I'm never going to be the artist that I want to be, or I can just forget everything I think I know about drawing, even though I've spent my whole life doing it. I can swallow my ego, swallow my pride, and just go back to the basics and just relearn and do it properly. And I chose option B because I didn't want to stop drawing. It was, despite the fact that I wasn't the artist that I wanted to be at the time, I couldn't stop drawing. It was really the only thing I was good at. It was the only thing I knew how to do. I wasn't really good at anything else. I at the time, I think I was learning how to be a hairdresser, and I worked in a hair salon for a few years, and I was pretty good at that, but it wasn't my passion, I needed something to be passionate about too. So I thought, well, I'm going to relearn, and I'm going to do it properly. So I really owed it to myself to learn properly. So I thought, if I go to these academies, even if it's just a workshop course, maybe I'll learn something useful. And so I actually did that first. I was doing a little bit of traveling, and there was this art academy in Florence, in Italy, and they were doing a summer workshop course. And I'm not going to name the academy, but I'll just say they were doing summer workshops. I think they also did workshops in winter as well. And it was a 2-week workshop course where we learned how to draw and paint the figure from life. And I thought, man, that would be extremely useful to me, because that's a good skill to have. Like, all of the good artists know how to do that, so I should learn how to do that too. And that's true to a degree, Drawing from life is an important skill to have. It trains your eye, and it trains proportional sensitivity. So that makes sense. So I went to this academy, and I did the workshop course because that's all I could afford, unfortunately. And I had a great time, I learned a lot about oil painting. I learned a lot about how to mix the mediums and the oil paint properly. And I learned how to see the figure and draw the proportions accurately using the comparative measuring method. So on and so forth, right? And then, so I come back home after my trip, and I'm painting figures and portraits. And that was kind of a useful skill, but as time went on, I realized that, I still didn't learn what I needed to learn, because I was still relying on copying from a reference. I came to this realization that I'm not going to deny it was a fantastic experience. It was like one of the best times of my life. Like, being in Florence and being surrounded by the architecture, and the food was amazing, and the academy was beautiful. But for my own artistic development, I still felt like I didn't really improve all that much, because I was still having to copy from references. I still could not draw from imagination. And a lot of people ask me, why is it so important to draw from imagination? Like, why is it such a big deal? It's a huge deal. It's the biggest deal to me, because it's like, if you can draw from imagination, then the sky's the limit. You can draw anything. Okay? If you want to draw like a complex scene of, like, I don't know, like gladiators in a coliseum or something like that, like, wouldn't it be awesome to just be able to draw that from your head without having to rely on references so much? Now, I'm not saying, never use references, because you're always going to need them. But, what I am saying is, how cool would it be if you could just picture a scene, whatever it was, and you could just get that on the canvas? So for me, it was a huge deal. And so I went to this workshop course and I learned a few things, which was great, but it still didn't get me to where I needed to go. And I realized that the methods that these academies are teaching, while they are valuable for learning to paint portraits and learning to paint in a lifelike way, they're not so useful if you want to be an illustrator or a concept artist, or, if you want to do high fantasy drawings and artworks and things like that. It's not really going to help you. So I went back to the drawing board and I figured out, I thought to myself, okay, I need to take a step back here, because I don't really know where I'm going with my artwork. And that was the first problem that I identified. I just had no clear direction of the kind of artist I wanted to be. So I thought to myself, okay, what kind of work do I want to produce? And so what I did was I just researched some artists, both past and present, but mostly past. I like to research artists of the Renaissance and the 18th century and the 19th century, all of the artists from the past, because their artwork has actually stood the test of time. They're still in museums because people love them and they enjoy them, and so they must have done something right. So I was looking at a lot of 19th century artists. I came across the works of Repin and Vasily Surikov and Vasily Vereshchagin. I don't know how to pronounce his name, something Russian. And I was also looking at artworks of, Western artists as well, like Bouguereau, who's, very popular. Solomon, J. Solomon. I was just doing some research and I was just trying to figure out, what kind of artwork do I like? What do I like looking at? And I loved the artwork of Bouguereau. A lot of people do, for good reason. But I wasn't really in love with his work. I was like, I don't really want to produce artworks like that. Like, they're beautiful, but that's not really me, So I kind of looked elsewhere, and then I was looking at what these Russian painters were doing back in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and I fell in love. Like, I was looking at Vasily Surikov's paintings, his just his massive multi-figural compositions, and I was just blown away. Like the Western artists were good. Like, they were very good. I mean, Jesus, they're much better than I am, for sure. But what the Russian artists were doing was just blowing my mind. And I looked at their paintings and I thought to myself, I would, if I could paint something like that even just once in my lifetime, I would die completely fulfilled. Like, I would die a very happy man. And so that was the first thing I had to do. I actually had to look at artists who I liked, and then I had to look at their artworks and figure out what kind of artworks did I like. And I did this with many artists, and I'm still doing it. Like, I'm always looking for treasures of the past and, sort of digging up old artworks that I haven't seen before. Pinterest is a great resource for that, by the way. Instagram is okay too, but I don't really like Instagram these days. Too many adverts. Pinterest is good. But anyway, so I was just looking at artwork, and I was like looking at the kind of artwork that I would like to produce, because that was really helpful for my art practice, because now I had a goal. I had this idea of what kind of paintings I wanted to create. And so the next thing I did was I was looking at these paintings and I was thinking to myself, okay, what subjects do I have to learn in order to learn to paint like that? So I did this workshop course. I know how to paint in oils, which was good. That was useful. I know how to mix oils. I know how to mix a palette. I know how to use the correct mediums and varnishes and blah, blah, blah. Like, okay, that technical stuff I've kind of got covered. All right, as far as materials goes. But what do I, as an artist, have to learn in order to be able to draw a large-scale composition like that? Like, how am I going to achieve that? And so I just looked at the paintings and I saw, okay, perspective. That's the obvious one, because everything we see in the real world is affected by perspective. And I only learned perspective during this time a few years ago. I only learned perspective on a very, very surface level. Like, I knew the basics, but I didn't really understand any of the deeper mechanics of it. So I thought, okay, perspective, I've got to learn that one. That's a must. That is a requirement. And so that's what I did. And I found that I thought it was going to be pretty easy because I was going to just draw some basic shapes and things like that. But it was not easy. Perspective is a rabbit hole of information. Like, it's one of those subjects you can spend years learning, and it's one of those subjects that the more you learn it, the more questions you have. It's seemingly endless. And I got to the point where I was getting very good at perspective, but there was a point where I just had to stop myself because I was like, okay, enough's enough. Like, I know enough now to draw perspective comfortably. Like, I don't have to be a master, but, I can draw it well enough now. But I spent years learning perspective alone. I think it took me about 3 years before I was really familiar with it properly. Because, let's say, for example, you're drawing a cube, right? You're drawing a cube in 2-point perspective. Okay, maybe you can freehand that, and maybe you can sketch something that kind of looks like a cube. But then the question is it a cube or is it a rectangular prism? Like, how do you create a cube that's proportionate? Because distortion is such a huge problem in perspective drawing, right? So that had me scratching my head for a while, and it took me a while to figure that one out. And then there was other things, like, how do I rotate that cube? Like, if I draw it in a particular angle, how do I rotate it to another angle? Okay? And then I was like, okay, so with these principles, then how do I apply them to the other basic shapes? Do you know what I mean? Like, there was a lot of deep mechanics that I wasn't even thinking about when I started learning perspective, because I never had to ask myself that question before, because I never studied it. So it was one of those subjects where the more I learned it, the more questions I had. And I did get to a point where I got very familiar with it. And I've since sort of honed my method so that I can draw very comfortably in perspective, which is mostly free from distortion, and it's accurate enough. So that was good, but man, it took me a long time to get there. I honestly did not think I would be spending as much time as I did learning perspective, but there you go. So that was the first subject. When I looked at these masters' paintings and I looked at what else I had to learn, there was human figures in there. So I was like, okay, well, I know how to draw a human figure from a reference. Like, I know how to copy from a photograph. And I also know how to paint a human from life. But that's just copying. I thought to myself, what if I have to draw a figure from imagination? How am I going to do that? Because when I was 25 years old, I tried doing that. Like, I was very good at drawing people from life and from reference. But when I tried to draw a human figure from imagination, it was awful. I just could not do it. And the reason I couldn't do it is because I never studied it. I never studied the proportions. I never studied the anatomy. I never studied the structure of the human figure and the way the bones move and the way the muscles squish and stretch and, all of those complicated things, I never studied it because I never had to. All I had to do was copy a reference. So, I realized that all this copying that I was doing was a huge weakness in my artwork. And so I decided, well, I'll start with the basics. I'll start with the proportions of the figure. And there's different canons for proportion, so that makes it a little more complicated. But, I researched some different ones, and I, decided to stick with the ones I liked. And then I decided to learn the anatomy. No, actually, I decided to learn the structure of the human figure. So before I moved on to anatomy, I was like, what's the structure of the human figure? So think about breaking the human figure into basic shapes. Like the torso could be a rectangular prism. So could the pelvis. The head could be either a box or a cylinder. The arms and the legs are cylinders. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, I thought about the structure of the human figure and how I could simplify it into shapes. So that's what I did first. And then once I did that, then I started learning human anatomy. And then once I learned human anatomy, I started to learn how the human body moves, and where the joints are and how they work. And so that, human anatomy is a huge, huge subject on its own. And it's always a subject you're going to be learning. So then coming back to these paintings, I saw that there was architecture in the paintings, and I thought, bloody hell, now I'm going to have to learn how to draw buildings too. But that's not too difficult if you know the laws of perspective, right? Now, classical proportions are tricky to learn, and there's a lot of they have their own classical canons which have to be adhered to if you want to draw them properly. But as long as you're equipped with perspective drawing skills, then you should be okay to learn that subject. So that one was fairly manageable. And so before I knew it, after a few years of doing this, of just, refining my perspective skills and then learning a new subject and then coming back to perspective and then learning another subject, I soon found myself drawing all kinds of different things. I was drawing people, I was drawing figures from imagination, I was drawing drapery, I was drawing architecture. I could draw architecture from imagination after researching the classical canons. And I was doing creature designs, like I did this drawing of the Cerberus, which I didn't think my art would take me there, but it did. And I was able to draw all of these different subjects because I focused a lot on perspective and also a fair bit on geometry, which was surprising. Geometry helps me more than I thought it would. And basically just building up my constructive drawing skills to a point where even if I wasn't familiarized too much with any subjects, such as animal anatomy, for example, like animals I struggle with, but even though I'm not the most familiar with it, I can still kind of draw it well enough because I'm equipped with those constructive drawing skills. So fast forward to today, and I'm drawing more than I ever thought I would draw back when I was 25 years old. When, if 25-year-old me could see what I was drawing today, he would not believe that I could draw that. Because back then I never thought I was going to get to this level. So, I guess I'm trying to understand what point it is I'm trying to make now, because I'm not trying to brag or anything. I'm just trying to, I guess, give you some of my ideas of a journey, of my art journey. And I think the point of this video is that if you feel demotivated, and if you're feeling exhausted, and you feel like you're not going to get to the place that you want to get to, first of all, don't quit, don't give up, and second of all, go back to the drawing board, because if you are struggling to draw something, I think it's either one or two things, and usually it's a lack of understanding of perspective drawing and construction drawing. So that's the first thing. So I think you should go back to the drawing board and learn the fundamentals. The second thing it could be is that maybe you're just not familiarized with that particular subject. Like animals, I struggle with. Like I'm kind of getting good at drawing horses now, but you know, I had to do a bit of practice for that. So that wasn't easy. But yeah, if you've kind of come to this point in your art journey where you feel like you're not improving, and you're not progressing in your artwork, it's not game over, okay? Because that's normal. You just have to accept that that's normal. Every artist plateaus at some point in their creative journey, and it just means you need to take a few steps back and go back to learning something. And usually it's perspective. That's usually the culprit. It's the fundamentals that are always going to help you the most. So if you're not familiarized yourself with the fundamentals of drawing, then I would definitely do that. And the fundamentals is basically just the basic shapes: cones, cubes, spheres, cylinders. You know, drawing them in perspective, casting their shadows, things like that. You know, that's what the fundamentals is about. It's about drawing three-dimensional objects in a believable way. So it's not game over. You just have to rethink your approach. Okay, I think that's what I'm trying to say. And you know, the second piece of advice I can give you is, you know, like I said earlier in the video, I really felt like giving up at some point when I was 25 years old, and I felt like my artwork was not good. I was about ready to put the pencils down, and I actually did for quite a long time. There was a point where I just didn't draw for months. So, and I kind of regret doing that now. You know, I kind of just wish I pushed through, but anyway. But what I wanted to say was just embrace the journey. You're never going to stop learning, okay? So if you're trying to draw realism or paint realistic things, just know this: you will never really, truly be a master, okay? Your artwork will never be perfect. Now, I'm not saying that to demotivate you, but I'm saying it so that you can just kind of relax and take a little bit of the pressure off yourself. Because while I think it's admirable that some artists strive for perfection, and I certainly do a lot of the times in my artwork, but you just have to know that it is unattainable. And instead of exhausting yourself trying to master all these different subjects that you want to draw, just embrace the journey and embrace the fact that there is always something new for you to learn. Okay? And that might sound like a bad thing if you're trying to be a perfectionist, that, you know, you're never going to be perfect at art, and you're never going to master the subjects that you want to master. But I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it's a good thing. I think it's a good thing that there's always going to be something new for you to learn. And you should think that's a good thing too, because that keeps art interesting. Okay? That's what makes drawing interesting, that there's always a challenge out there for us. Okay? So don't feel exhausted by that. I want you to get excited. I want you to be excited that there's always something new on the horizon for you, because then it will never get boring that way. And I guess to finish this video off, I'm going to leave you with this quote that one of my artist's friends, he said to me, you know, we were having this conversation about how hard it is to draw and paint, and, you know, that it was like a seemingly endless journey of just learning and never really getting anything quite perfect. And he said to me, drawing is meant to be hard. If drawing was easy, then it wouldn't be special. And man, when he told me that, it's like I just relaxed after that, because that's the truth. If drawing was easy, it wouldn't be special. So always remember that.